Hi, welcome to the Mind Report. I'm Laurie Santos, professor at Yale University and coming to you today from my field site in Puerto Rico. And today I'm talking with
Francesca Gino. I'm a behavioral scientist and professor at Harvard Business School.
And today Francesca and I are going to be talking about the irrelevant factors that can derail your decisions. For those that don't know, Francesca just finished a new book called Sidetracked, Why Our Decisions Get Derailed and How to Stick to the Plan. And since I bet many of our viewers are excited to find better ways to stick to their plans, I thought it'd be fun to talk with Francesca about some of her cool work these days. So first off, Francesca, how did you get involved in kind of studying human decision-making and some of our irrational tendencies? What was the process that led you to start studying some of this stuff in the first place?
Many of the research questions that I investigate and study are based on my own experience and the patterns of behavior that I observe around me. And so I noticed that in a lot of cases, I was setting out to do X and ended up doing Y instead. And so I started looking around and talking to friends and colleagues and see if this was a common experience, and it seemed to be the case. And so I was fascinated by trying to understand why this happens, and not only that, what is it that we can do about it so that we are better at staying on track.
And I mean, one of the cool things I like about the book is the book highlights a lot of things that are going on both inside our minds and in the context of the world we live in that can actually be messing up our decisions in ways that we don't realize, these kind of irrelevant factors. One of my favorite ones that you talk about towards the beginning of the book is a set of irrelevant factors that have to do with our own incorrect beliefs about our own competence and how we're going to perform. So this is some of your work that you've talked about in terms of the better than average effect. Do you want to explain what that effect is?
Yeah, I think the best example of that comes from a survey that was done by U.S. World News in 1997, where they asked people to indicate who was most likely to go to heaven. And they had a series of people such as Bill Clinton. They also had Michael Jordan, Mother Teresa. And what was interesting about the data is that if you look at the percentages that people indicated, I don't remember the number correctly, but Bill Clinton, I think, got a 58 or 59. Michael Jordan was a little bit higher in the 60s. And Mother Teresa's got a 79% chance of going to heaven. But what is interesting is that respondents themselves indicated that they had a chance, an 87% chance of going to heaven. And so what the examples does is that they are even holier than Mother Teresa. And we have these tendencies, and they're very common on all sorts of positive dimensions, from how attractive we are, how good we are at making decisions, how good we are at taking others' perspectives or understanding others. We rate ourselves better than average. And I often go through this simple exercise when I teach classes on decision-making and negotiation. And it's quite funny to ask people to rate themselves on a series of dimensions compared to the other people in the classroom. And then you sort of ask them now if across the various dimensions the average is higher than 51%, just raise your hand, and you see 99% of the classroom raising their hands. And so realizing that it's a mathematical impossibility for everybody to be better than everybody else in the classroom, but also a tendency that we have that can get us in trouble.
And one of the spots you talk about in the book where it gets us in trouble is our ability to kind of seek help and seek advice when we kind of don't know the answers correctly, right?
Exactly. So there are lots of situations where we need others' advice or opinions on decisions that we're making or that a difficult situation that we're facing. And there is actually a lot of evidence from behavioral decision-making studies showing that others' advice is quite helpful. But because of this tendency of thinking so highly of ourselves and our own competence, we tend not to listen to the advice that we receive. And instead, we tend to listen too much to our own opinions and ideas.
So give me an example of some of the experimental tasks you use to look at this effect.
Yeah, so when we take these studies into the lab, we have very simple paradigms. So one that I used in the past is presenting people with a series of pictures of others and their task is to guess the weight of the person in the picture, just estimate how much they weigh. And the first they write down their own estimate, and then they receive advice from another person who saw the same picture. And what we see very regularly is that, again, people give a lot of weight to their own estimate when they give a final judgment in terms of how much the person weighs, and they tend to discount the estimate that they receive from another person.
Mm-hmm. And so just, even though those estimates in theory would help the participants do better.
Exactly.
Yeah. One of my other favorite things about your work is you've shown that this phenomenon, this kind of better than average effect, particularly in the context of getting advice, isn't just an all or nothing thing, but it can be pushed around by other kinds of contextual factors. One of my favorite ones is sort of the power dynamic of the situation. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of those new studies?
Yeah, that was motivated actually by doing these type of exercises in the classroom and having executives saying, I know, but if I were to be an expert, and with the power that I have and the experience that I have, I'm sure that I would not fall prey to this type of biases. And so I said, okay, let's put it to a test. And it turns out that power exacerbates the problem. Then even if it's just a subjective sense of power, so we actually don't have control over others' resources, but we experience a sense that we do, that's enough to make us even less willing to listen to the advice that we receive from others.
And you can actually induce people to feel powerful or not powerful using experimental techniques, right?
Exactly. So we rely on research that Adam Galinsky and his colleagues have done, where you can just ask people very simply to think about and write about a situation from their past where they experience power because they had control over over resources that affected others. And that is enough to trigger these feelings of power and to lead to the type of results that we see in our experiments.
Yeah, it's super cool. Although you also can see some contextual effects that get people to actually respect advice even more. One of my favorite counterintuitive ones is how much people end up paying for advice in the consulting they get, right?
Yes. It's funny because it was motivated by a personal story of my dad, who's a doctor, telling me that he was upset because it seems like every time people went to him and had to pay for his advice, they were listening to the recommendation that he was making of behaving in more healthy ways or working out more regularly, etc., etc. And instead, when people were just receiving the advice without paying for it, it seems like the recommendations went nowhere. And so I put them to a test, and his intuition was correct. When we pay for advice because of a sense that we spent the money and we made an investment, we actually tend to listen to it. And it's interesting because in 2010, I worked for the summer at a Fortune 500 company, and we were working on some research together, and one of my first tasks was to find a panel of respondents who would answer a long survey that would help us understand certain customers' behavior, and then from there we would design some field experiments. And I spent a lot of time on the task, and since we are scientists, we know where to find people who can offer panels, and I got back to the team with different quotes. And I was incredibly happy because one of the quotes was for $20,000 and the other one for just half of that, $10,000. And I said, well, I'm very happy. And I told the people who can get us the responses for $10,000 that we want to go with them. And they had me go back and actually get the deal from the company that made the $20,000 offers. And the reason was that they thought that the data would be more convincing in the eyes of other people inside of the company if we spent more money to collect it. So it was a nice example of exactly what I studied a few years earlier.
Yeah, I mean, consulting firms must love this result.
Exactly.
Yeah, you charge a lot of money. That's awesome. Well, hopefully they'll at least pay a lot for the book so that we get good advice from the book there too. But One of the things I wanted to ask, though, is we see all these kinds of biases playing out, and they seem to be bad for our overall ability to make correct decisions, particularly in this case, right? Like thinking you're better than you actually are might cause you to make all kinds of mistakes in terms of getting advice and all kinds of cases. Is there anything useful to having a better than average bias, or is it always bad?
Yeah, so psychologists have looked at these questions for many, many years, and there are certainly some benefits. So, for example, feeling that you're better than average or feeling more optimistic have been shown to have some good health effects. And I am not saying that people should become pessimistic all of a sudden. I think that what I am suggesting is that we become more aware of the fact that we do have these inflated views of how good we are, and we consider that fact when we're making decisions, because sometimes we can actually get derailed in the way we implement our plans just because we think too highly of ourselves.
Yeah, and that's kind of a message that comes across in the book in a couple of different ways. This idea of kind of just being aware of some of the influences that affect your biases might help you. Another domain where you talk about that a lot is in the context of emotion and kind of being aware of your own emotional temperature. One of my favorite bits of your work has shown kind of in some ways the importance of other people expressing gratitude to you to make you feel happy and do more pro-social things down the line. So do you want to talk a little bit about some of these new gratitude studies?
Yeah, it's funny because the Harvard Gazette just wrote a piece about this research, and I keep receiving email from random people who are thanking me for writing the research, and I think they're trying to heighten my sense of self-worth and making me more helpful towards others. So this is research that I conducted with Adam Grant at Wharton, and what we were interested in seeing is how powerful simple expressions of gratitude can be. And what we find is that when you express gratitude toward the person who helped you, you basically make this person feels that she or he this person is going to feel very valued, and his or her sense of self-worth is going to be heightened. And what is interesting is that as a result of those heightened feelings of self-worth, this person is going to be more likely to help you out if you have another request for help. And maybe that's not so surprising. So if I were to help you out and you thank me, then I'm going to be more likely to help you out again compared to a situation where you say nothing. What I think is very surprising is how much more likely I am to help another person down the road. So if I helped you and you were nice enough to thank me, then I'm actually much more likely to help another person who's going to ask for help. So the ripple down effects were quite surprising in this research.
But that seems to be a kind of growing feature of some of the work in the sort of helping literature, right? Is that these kinds of things that influence helping that you might expect to happen in the context of like one person helping another person and kind of reciprocating over time, those things can actually influence helping like more broadly. Like it seems like some of the mechanisms are kind of broad. They take into account all kinds of information, but they don't necessarily just benefit the person who's helping you, right?
Exactly, and I think it's kind of nice to see those type of effects, and they seem to be driven by how we feel about our own actions, but also the reactions that others had thanks to our helping. So
Yeah,
it's a little bit like this. We sort of jokes, but it seems like a little thanks can go a long way in this case.
Yeah, and I think that one of the cool things about that is that you're kind of able to have people's emotional temperatures work both ways, right? So the gratitude work suggests that experiencing other people being grateful makes you more likely to help and sort of make correct decisions, but then you also see in some of your other work that some of these negative emotions like anger and so on can actually influence decision making in a more irrational direction or in a worse direction, right?
Exactly. And anger seems to be a particularly relevant one when it comes to decision making, because oftentimes it leads to some irrational behaviors such that we really lose track of what the plan was to start with, and we get derailed quite easily.
Yeah. Another thing that sort of seems to work somewhat like anger in some of your other work is kind of the feelings of losses or feeling like you're missing out on certain kinds of things. This is something that, of course, has been a feature in decision-making since the work of Connor and Tversky and others. But I thought that some of your work on kind of missing out on different reward opportunities was particularly neat from a kind of perspective of how to motivate people better. So do you want to talk about some of those studies?
Yeah, so this is research that I conducted with Scott Wiltermuth, and we were intrigued by the idea that we could look at different emotions that people might experience because of different type of experimental manipulations and settings, and how that could actually boost their motivation. And we have done some research looking at how the fear of missing out is something that people can experience quite strongly. And we were intrigued by seeing how far this fear could go in terms of motivating you to take actions and work harder on tasks. So we conducted a series of studies where you get rewarded for your effort and performance. And so imagine, for example, knowing I ask you to transcribe some text, and depending on how long you work on this task, you get a reward or multiple rewards. So if you work on it for 10 minutes, you get a reward. If you work on it for 20 minutes, you get a couple of rewards. And what we have done is create completely meaningless categories of rewards. So we took the rewards and we divided them up into different categories. And
so what were these kinds of rewards, just to get a sense of how the study went?
Like objects that students, for example, might care about. So notebooks, pens, or mugs. So again, interesting objects, but not the coolest rewards on the planet. And to take this manipulation to the extreme, in a sense, we talked about the rewards, we asked the students to look at them, and then we placed them in different containers in the condition in which we wanted to create meaningless categories. And in the other condition, instead, they were all in the same container. And what we found is that people are more likely to work harder on the task, which meant actually working for longer, when the rewards were divided into categories, because they didn't want to miss out.
I see. So what the moral of the story, if you're trying to get people to work harder, so say you're trying to get your kids to do better or something, is to not give more rewards, but to give more kinds of rewards?
Exactly.
Is that safe to say? Yeah.
Exactly. Just create some categories. And it might be enough to say you can get the first reward from the first category if you do X, and if you also do Y, there is a second reward from a different category. It seems to be psychologically driven.
That's neat. Although it also plays on this idea that the fact that you have these counterintuitive intuitions about what motivates people kind of lines up with the second set of influences that you talk about in your book, which is the fact that sometimes our theories about other social agents are wrong, and that can actually derail our decisions because we kind of can't correctly perspective take on what other people are thinking. Some of my favorite of your work, which everyone talks about around the holiday time, is the fact that people are bad gift givers in general, or we have lots of biases at gift giving. Do you want to talk about some of those findings?
Yeah. So we are very, as you were saying, we are very bad at putting ourselves in the shoes of others when it comes to predicting what they might like. And what I find striking about that research is that or this context is that we experienced in our past being givers, but we also experienced being receivers. So in a sense, we should know what we appreciate as receivers, and we should be able to anticipate that when we are in the role of givers. This is actually research that is motivated by, again, a personal experience. So when I got married, I made a list with my husband, and a lot of people ended up not paying attention to it and buying something different. And
Yeah.
I'm sure that they were trying their best to be thoughtful and to go the extra mile to buy something that we would appreciate. But in reality, I think we ended up regifting or giving away most of the presents that we received that were not on the list and we didn't ask for. And
Nice.
our research shows exactly that, is that people oftentimes create wish lists for the gifts that they want. But some people decide not to pay attention to the wish list and they think about going the extra mile and buying something different, thinking that the other person, the receiver, is going to think of them as more thoughtful and they're going to appreciate the gift more. And in reality, they don't. It's just the opposite. People prefer the gifts that are on the wish list and they think that they're more thoughtful when they receive gifts that they asked for. So I think we can all learn from that. It was my assistant's birthday a couple of weeks ago, and I actually asked him for a list of things that he would appreciate receiving.
Now, knowing that, did it make you feel still okay as the giver? Because kind of thinking about, because I do this all the time where I'll get lists and then apparently I'm a bad giver because I'll come up with this awesome thing that someone will want. Knowing that and following the list, does it make you feel less good about the gift?
Yeah, in a sense it did, but the way I framed it to him, I said I am a true believer that we should pay attention and learn from our own research, and my research shows X, that I should ask for a list to make sure that you appreciate the gift that I'm going to buy for you. And so I think I got a laughter out of him and also a list, and I think he did appreciate the present.
That's great. Well, but it also raises this bigger question, I think, about the whole research program, which is, your book is one of many books that talks about a lot of our irrational decision-making biases, and the message is often, let's just be aware of these things and kind of follow what the research tells us to do on how to make decisions better. But my read is that we actually don't know how much having awareness actually makes us better. In other words, if you've read your book and you know about the biases, do you actually do better on some of these decision-making tasks, and kind of can you override some of these kinds of biases? What do we know about that? And if anything, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that as scholars, as behavioral scientists, we are often very interested in describing these irrationalities. We might see them in our own behaviors and in the behaviors of others, and we want to explain them, which is obviously really important, but we know much less on how to debias ourselves. One of the reasons why I wrote the book was to basically describe a set of principles. That's how I call them. Maybe a better name would be strategies or type of questions that we should make sure we ask so that we can actually stick to the plan. Thinking about, for example, the role of emotions and how they can derail us, one of the principles I talk about is called take your emotional temperature. And maybe it's just a label that I'm hoping is going to stick into people's heads, so that at the time they're making decisions, they're asking them the question, I should take my emotional temperature. Are there emotions that seems to be affecting the way I'm deciding on this particular decision or choice? So,
and in the emotion domain, we know that having awareness that you're being emotional when you're making decisions can actually affect how much those emotions play in, right? I think particularly kind of the anger domain, if you point out to somebody, might be more angry than usual, then the effects you get from anger are less, correct?
Exactly. And you could imagine, I actually have students who know about the research that I've done in this area, who have reported back trying to use the principle of taking their emotional temperature. And so just to give you an example, since I teach decision-making and negotiation, a lot of the examples come from their context, and they report back saying, I was in these very difficult negotiations, and the other party was being very difficult, and I realized that I was getting really angry, and I decided to suggest taking a break and coming back to the negotiation table once emotions were off. So I think that there are ways of using the principle that I discuss in a way that can be helpful. And they have to do with being a little bit more aware of what's coming in the way of good decision making.
Yeah, and one of the domains you talk about in terms of decisions that this might be most helpful in is in the context of kind of cheating and dishonest sorts of behaviors. I mean, that's the spot where, in some ways, we have the most irrelevant factors affecting our decisions, and the spot where we really want those irrelevant factors not to be affecting our decisions.
Yeah.
I know with Dan Ariely and colleagues, guys were looking at what I think is the most fantastic irrelevant factor that can make us dishonest, which is what brand of sunglasses we're wearing at the time, right?
Yeah, one of the reasons why, as you were saying, I'm intrigued by the morality contest is because it's one where when you talk to people, they say, oh, I have a very strong moral compass. I would never be sidetracked by anything. And in reality, even in that context, situational forces can lead us astray. So in the research that you were mentioning, what we did was to look at ways in which products that we wear, like the type of sunglasses, can actually make us feel inauthentic. They can make us feel like a fraud. And as a result of that, we might behave like a fraud and cheat more on a series of tasks.
So describe the cheating task of how you can get subjects to cheat in the lab.
Yeah, so together with Ariely and other colleagues, we developed a task where imagine coming into the lab and having to solve math problems. And if you look at them, they seem not too difficult. They're a little bit of imagine like a matrix with different cells and numbers, and you're asked to find the two numbers that sum up to 10. So again,
so it's like super hard Sudoku. But...
Yeah, but if I put you under time pressure, so I give you only 4 or 5 minutes to solve all the 20 problems, it turns out that it's actually quite a difficult task. So most people do not solve all the problems, and in fact, most people solve about 5 to 6 or 7 problems within the time frame. So what we do in order to give people the opportunity to cheat is we give them the opportunity to self-report their own performance. So usually we have control conditions where the experimenter after the 5 minutes looks over your work and says you got 5 correct, here's the pay. And instead in the conditions where there is an opportunity to cheat, people actually self-report their level of performance and then they get paid. And what is interesting across all sorts of studies that we've done using this task is that most people cheat when they have the opportunity to do so, but they cheat by a little bit. Then Ariely talks about the fudge factor, and I think it's actually quite a nice label. What this suggests is that we cheat enough that there is a benefit. So in our studies, if you perform better, then you get more money on the task, but not too much that we need to change what we think about ourselves. So since we're cheating only a little bit, we don't go back and revise our fantastic views of how moral we are.
But then one of the factors that can actually affect how much we cheat is the authenticity of the glasses we're wearing.
Exactly. Right? So in that study, we were looking exactly at that. So everybody was asked to wear sunglasses. We told them that this was for a marketing study where we were interested in them telling us what they thought of the product that they were wearing. And we told some of the participants that the sunglasses that they were wearing were actually fake. And just that was enough to make them feel inauthentic and cheat more on the following tasks.
Right. So just having, and the claim is that being primed that some aspect of your behavior is already inauthentic causes you to be inauthentic and cheat more in other kinds of tasks.
Exactly.
Yeah. Another one of the factors you've seen that can influence our moral behavior is kind of who else we're with and how they're behaving as well, particularly if those other individuals are in our in-group, right?
Yes, we conducted a series of studies to look at the effect that other people's behavior has on our own. And these are studies that I conducted when I was on the faculty at Carnegie Mellon University. And the results, I think, were quite interesting and somehow worrisome. So we used the type of task that I was describing earlier, where you would come to the lab and you would have to solve math problems, and you would be paid based on your performance. And everybody in the room was a Carnegie Mellon student. And for this series of experiments, we actually hired a confederate, and his role was to basically make other participants aware of the fact that you could cheat and you could get away with it. So the confederate was supposed to stand up after the first 60 seconds and basically say, I'm done with everything, what should I do? And the experimenter said, well, if you got all the answers correctly, just pay yourself and leave. So it was clear that the person was cheating because it's impossible to solve everything correctly in just a minute. And in some of the conditions, in some of the sessions, we asked this person to just wear a regular Carnegie Mellon t-shirt. So it was a peer, a person like them, an in-group member. And in other cases, he was wearing a sweatshirt from the University of Pittsburgh. And if you've been in Pittsburgh, there is quite a bit of rivalry between the two universities. Students don't like the students of the other university for sports reasons. And what we saw in the data is that when you see that another person like you is cheating, you're more likely to cheat. So it is as if you're taking the other person's behavior as setting the norm. So if a peer is cheating, then it's fine to cheat, and I'm going to cheat as well. But when the person is an outgroup member, so a person you don't like, then you tend to distance yourself from the bad apple, and you tend not to cheat.
Do the folks in the pit condition cheat less, or do they cheat just as much as they would if there was no competitor? Like, is seeing an outgroup member do it bad make you better, or? Yeah,
it's almost making you honest, but not quite. So you're still cheating a little bit, but less than, significantly less than the condition in which the person showing you that it's okay to cheat is an in-group member.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, it suggests that there might be some really powerful social norms at play. But yet you also have work showing that even incredibly superficial similarities with somebody who's doing something bad can cause you to do something bad too.
Exactly. It's the most subtle similarities, like sharing the same birthday, that are enough to create a sense of psychological connection and lead us to behave badly.
So talk a little bit about those,
Yeah, so we actually also looked at not only about the fact that unethical behavior can be contagious, but we also asked the question of what about the good behaviors, what about ethical behavior? And I think we need to do more research on that. But the research that we've done so far suggests that, yes, also ethical and moral behavior can be contagious, but the effect is not as strong. So we are more likely to follow the bad apple than we are to follow the good one.
Huh, that's interesting. It suggests that the power of these social norms might be more to tell you what your fudge factor is than to tell you what you should be doing.
Exactly.
Huh, that's cool.
It's an interesting asymmetry.
Yeah. Well, we only have a few more minutes, and so I wanted to end kind of on a positive note with your helpful tips of what people can do to be better decision makers. For the full set of tips, I should say that folks should go out and pick up your new book, Sidetracked, because you kind of go through, I think, 9 or 10 different suggestions of how to not get derailed. But do you want to give us, like, you know, the top 3 hints that folks should be thinking about in terms of making better decisions?
Yes. So I think the first one is one that you suggested, which is the first principle that I talk about, raising your own awareness. I think that starting asking ourselves questions of whether the views that we have of ourselves are too inflated or whether we're being accurate is an important step to take. If we want to implement our plans the way we thought of them initially. It seems that the principle that help us understand our emotions is also a helpful one. So the idea of taking your emotional temperature and understanding whether there are emotions either triggered by the situation or something else that are intervening and swaying your decision is also important. And then I want to talk about the one of the principles that I talk about later in the book, that is considering your source. And what I mean by that is making sure that you're carefully considering the type of information that is entering your decision-making process and making sure that it's actually relevant rather than irrelevant information.
So I want to give one quick example of kind of considering the source online?
Yes, so I have done some research building on what psychologists and behavioral decision scientists call the input bias. So it's this idea that if you're evaluating a person and trying to understand how this person is working, if the person spends a lot of time in the office, you might consider that as a sign that the person is very productive, when in fact the person might be in the office just surfing the web. So that is a case where you're looking at some information that is completely irrelevant and you're taking into account as you're making decision. Another very common situation is the one where you're evaluating the behavioral performance of others and you're completely discounting the role that the situation played. For example, imagine thinking about people to promote, or in a context where Don Moore and other colleagues and I have done some research, the context of admissions to MBA programs. Oftentimes, even admissions officers who are expert tend to pay too much attention to the person's GPA and completely discount the fact that the GPA has more meaning in context. So if you're a person with a perfect GPA from a school where everybody else has a very high GPA, then you should account for that. And even the experts tend not to do so.
So the idea is make sure you're considering the situation and the source of the information before you make your decision, and hopefully at least that will raise your awareness to do a little bit better.
Exactly.
Perfect. Well, we are about out of time, but I wanted to thank you, Francesca, for joining us on the Mind Report, and to remind our listeners that they should be checking out Francesca's new book, Sidetracked, Why Our Decisions Get Derailed, and What You Can Do to Stick to the Plan. Thanks so much. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You can hit stop on your play there.